afternoon and welcome to the September edition of the Conservation Outcomes webinar series. My name is Liz Marshall and I serve as the Outcomes Team Leader for NRCS's Outcomes Team. The Outcomes Team hosts this webinar series to highlight NRCS's conservation outcomes and quantification efforts, as well as to demonstrate innovative conservation tools and to highlight data that can assist with conservation planning and impact assessment. The webinars generally take place on the fourth Thursday of each month at 3 p.m. We'll get started with just a second, but I first want to go over a couple logistics. First of all, the webinar is being recorded, so all participants joining today's webinar are in listen-only mode, and all of the audio is being broadcast through your device's speakers. If you're having problems with your audio, computer or mobile device headsets can help sometimes with your audio quality and volume. Also, please note that there is a closed captioning link provided in the box on your screen entitled Today's Links. The captions open in a new browser window where you can follow along with the presenter's comments. And although we don't have audio enabled for you, we still want you to be able to participate in today's webinar. So please type any questions or comments into the Q&A box that you'll shortly see appearing on your screen. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation. However, questions will be taken and answered at the end of the presentation. Please also note the connection status bar indicator that's to the right of the help button in the very upper right corner of your screen on the Adobe Connect menu bar. If all of your bars show as green, that generally means you have a strong network connection and you shouldn't have any problem joining today's webinar. But if you have a weak connection or if you experience interruptions in bandwidth that prevent you from participating in today's webinar, the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be accessible through the Conservation Outcomes webinar series webpage. The link to that site is in the box on your screen labeled Today's Links. And please also note that there is a PDF of today's slides available to download from the box on your screen entitled Today's Handouts. And finally, if you're willing to forego the links in the download box and the Q&A boxes in order to make the presentation larger, you can use the icon with the 4 corner arrows that appears in the upper right of the presentation box to make the slides appear in full screen. All right, I'm now pleased to turn the microphone over to Ron Alvarado to open today's webinar. Ron Alvarado is Acting Associate Chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. After the Associate Chief's introductory remarks, we will turn the reins over to Patrick Flanagan. Patrick is the National Statistician for NRCS's National Resources Inventory Program, and he will be conducting today's webinar. Thank you, and now over to you, Associate Chief Alvarado.
Well, thank you, Liz, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the September 24th NRI webinar. We really appreciate your participation, and I'm sure the team here is looking forward to all the great dialogue that's going to happen here. So the National Resources Inventory, or NRI, is 35 years of monitoring at over 800,000 points across the United States. I remember early in my career in 1993 going out on one of those points. I'm curious where that point was in this history here. That was north of Albuquerque. But before the NRI, there were a number of conservation need inventories done going back to 1935. However, the NRI has been conducted more consistently since 1982 at the same locations using the same scientific
Your line is now muted.
methods. NRI offers measures of change over time in characteristics like land cover use, soil condition, soil erosion, prime farmland, conservation practices, and wetlands. So some very key areas of natural resources across the landscape. The NRI also functions as a foundation for the conservation effects assessment projects, what we refer to as SEEP, modeling of effectiveness of conservation practices, the Soil and Water Resources Conservation Act, RCA, national appraisals, and the USDA greenhouse gas inventory modeling. In general, the NRI provides the necessary data driven information on status, condition, and trends of natural resources to support stewardship decisions by USDA, other federal agencies, and landowners. So you can see that this NRI is very critical to the work that we do, not only as a federal agency, but across state and federal agencies. So with that, I want to again thank everyone for participating today, and we look forward to engaging with you today. And at this point, I'll pass it over to Patrick.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce the 2017 National Resources Inventory. We refer to it as the NRI, and I will probably use that acronym a lot in my presentation. I'm Patrick Flanagan. I'm the National Statistician for the NRI, and this development is the culmination of years of processing and data collection and estimation that produced this database of 35 years of data. During this webinar, I will describe an overview of the NRI, how we collect the data, who uses the data, and give examples of the types of data that we have and how to get access to the data. As I briefly mentioned, and as Ron Alvarado mentioned, there's 35 years of characteristic data in the on national resources at over 800,000 points on the ground. It includes soil characteristics, erosion, wetlands, crops, land cover use, conservation practices, to name just a few. Because it's recollected at the same points, it allows not only net change over time, but also gross change, and I'll describe that as we go along. And it allows analyses of relationships between those characteristics. And it also allows using the NRI database as a focus sampling frame for other studies. And I'll mention a couple of those. The current NRI started with the 1972 Rural Development Act. It mandated that land monitoring program be established covering erosion, soil and water and related resources, and land use changes. There was other statements in there as well, but those are the primary areas that it mandated. And the other thing it mandated was that the release of the information had to be done at 5-year increments. As Ron had mentioned, we had data collections going back to 35, but they were not that frequent, and they were not connected by the same points, and they were not all in the same database. So there's some distinct advantages to this current NRI. After the 1972 Act, the first attempt was made in 1977, and it had the indicated number of sample areas, and it had a collection of characteristics that were collected. Then in the 1980 RCA analysis, they found that when they tried to analyze what's required by that law, that the sample size was too small to dig down into the geographic areas that they needed to dig down to. And it also didn't collect data on a lot of characteristics that were of major interest. And so it went back to the drawing board, and we ended up with 1982, which is the current version and also the beginning of the database that I'm describing today. Much larger number of sample areas and a much wider number of characteristics. And then after 1982, that went on. Now, that was all of the points were collected in 82, 87, 92, and 97. But along the way, there were a lot of issues with trying to do such a massive collection in, all at once in those 5-year points. So design was created to shift to an annual design, which started in 2000. And an annual design, it's a smaller sample using what they call a core and rotation. Some of the sample is collected every year and others rotate in and out. It made far more sense logistically and financially. It made statistically quite a bit more complicated than the original design, but it's much easier as I'll describe. The initial sample that was done in '82 and continued as the base sample to this date was in two stages. The first stage selected area segments, we use the term segments to refer to them, in every county across the portion of the United States that we collect in a spatially balanced fashion. Most of those little areas are 160 acres. They were randomly selected, and then inside each of those areas, points were selected, also using a spatially balanced method. And most of the segments have 3 such points. And most of the data is collected at those points. This is just a quick map of the segments covering the United States. The segment was sampled in a way, there's 300,000 of those segments, but it was sampled in a way that it was sampled more densely, where there was a lot of heterogeneity, or basically variability, of land cover and characteristics. So further out west, where there is less variability, there was not quite as dense a sample, but still a substantial sample in every county. So in 1982, when the collection was done, it was done all on the ground by people going out to the points and collecting the data. And then it became pretty clear that that was a very expensive way to go. So starting 1987, there was some experimentation on whether or not the same quality of data could be achieved using aerial photography. So that was where this experimenting started. And by the time we got to 97, all of the data was collected with remote sensing. However, there is some data you cannot collect with remote sensing. Mostly, a lot of it is related to erosion, so we have a two-phase process where we first collect data using remote sensing, and then we send segments that have cropland and pasture land and to the NRCS state offices, where they collect those more intricate pieces of information associated with erosion. Well, the other thing on the experimentation that was interesting was when they started experimenting, they found that there had to be a fairly high resolution, and a lot of the remote sensing data available was not available at the resolution needed. And so most of the time we collect using our own aerial photography contracts. So this depicts the data collection flow. First you start with the aerial photography, and then those photographs or images are sent to remote sensing labs where most of the data is collected. And as I said before, areas with cropland, pasture land, and frankly, General Conservation Reserve Program land is sent to the NRCS state offices for local data. And the NRCS state offices use a combination of administrative records and local knowledge to enter that information, and then it's passed back to the remote sensing labs. And sometimes they have to resolve some discrepancies between their two collections before it finally completes the raw data and it's sent to Iowa State. Iowa State then does quality assurance examination and then the rather complex estimation process. And then the database during release years is compiled and provided to NRCS. So the 2017 NRI data set, it covers 49 states in the Caribbean, all but Alaska and Pacific territories. Alaska was collected in 2007, and there are plans for implementing in Alaska for every year that are in the works. Same thing with the follow-on to Alaska, which would be the Pacific territory. As I said before, there was annual sampling from 2000 on, so the database has 1982, 87, 92, and 97, and then from 2000 on, the database has characteristics in every year, all the way up to 2017, the current release. I should add that when we have a new release like 2017, when we have a new release like for 2017, the data is much more than just stacking the 2016 and 17 collections on top of the 2015 that was previously released. The way we collect data, we always are back checking to make sure that particularly that change is genuine. In which case, somebody who's collecting data at the remote sensing labs who is going to collect data for, say, 2016, and the previous time it was collected in, say, 2012, then they not only collect the data in 2016, but they also examine whether the data was collected properly in 2012, particularly when change is observed. So when we have a new release like 2017, the data set is in its entirety, going all the way back to 82, is better than what was previously released. And sometimes you will see differences because of that back checking and some quality assurance and consistency checking that is done when the releases are compiled. Finally, the data set that we have has weights, and those weights allow us to compile estimates at various geographic levels and make them statistically unbiased. Another point of interest about this data set is that it's governed by confidentiality law. The confidentiality law is meant to protect the data that is collected on people's lands. So in the actual point locations and segment locations are legally protected. So the way the confidentiality law is written, it specifies that only aggregated data can be released outside of USDA. We do have some people who use the data sets with segment and point locations, but those people are either in USDA or are under some type of formal agreement with USDA to perform analysis on that level. Some of the users of NRI data, the frequent users, are on this page. Congress is a frequent user. They're constantly asking for data related to whatever law they're working on, and it particularly becomes poignant on when they're working on farm bills, where they have something under consideration and they will ask for data to illustrate aspects of that are being considered for the farm bills. Along with Congress, there's the USDA greenhouse gas inventory. That inventory feeds into the U.S. entry of data to the UN on not only greenhouse gas, but climate change and things of that nature. That inventory actually uses the NRI point locations as a scientifically credible sample upon which they can develop estimates of uncertainty. So it really heavily depends on the greenhouse gas inventory. The Economic Research Service uses the data extensively. I mentioned before, the Resource Conservation Act report analyses uses the NRI data extensively. And the Conservation Effects Assessment Project conducts a farmer survey that not only is sampled from the NRI, but uses NRI data in its modeling elements. And other aspects of the Conservation Effects Assessment Project also use NRI data for their analyses and modeling. Some other NRI users, the NRCS state offices, we provide data to them to use not only for their own use, but for the cooperators that they deal with. We provide data to the NRCS technical centers. We get a lot of requests for data from other agencies. Some examples are there: USGS, Forest Service, Farm Service Agency, and the Government Accountability Office are just some. We get many requests from those and other agencies. We get requests from academia extensively, not only from the universities themselves, but often from students who are trying to work on projects related to the data we collect. And we get a lot of requests from special interest users. Various conservation-related entities throughout the United States ask for data on a regular basis. One example of using the NRI as a source of focused sampling, there's two of them here. The first one is the Conservation Effects Assessment Project Farmer Survey. It samples crop and pasture points to ID operators for the survey, and then farmer surveys are conducted to gather an immense amount of data that feeds into their modeling efforts to examine conservation practice effectiveness. Also, there's the Grazing Lands On-Site, which is an NRI project that's a comparatively small sample, but it covers range and pasture. And in this case, the points are collecting data you can't collect with remote sensing and isn't necessarily available on administrative records, where they actually go to the ground and take soil samples and collect a wide range of vegetation data and basically health data on range and pasture, which combine to make grazing lands. Most of the analysis of that data takes place with a grazing lands analysis team, but we're gradually shifting to a production database where we can provide that data to the outside world. It's not really in the greatest shape for that now, but it's a wonderful collection of data that's sort of unique in its own regard. We've also done special studies along the way where data has been sampled, or a sample has been taken from the NRI to focus on the particular subject, and then other data is collected thereafter. This is typically what one of the first things we put on the summary report. The summary report is a report that sort of identifies that we have a new release, and it gives some overview results, and this is one, and that is how much of these, what we call broad cover uses, and what percentage of the United States is covered by each. As you can see, forest, range, and cropland make up the largest areas, and that rural land in general makes up about 70% of the area that we cover. One of the biggest issues for the NRI is change over time. The simple change is called net change, and that means if you have point A and point B, how much has each of the land cover, in this case, this illustration, land cover use, how much is it increased or decreased from point A to point B. For example, on this one, it shows that cropland since 1982 has dropped by a substantial amount, and that developed land has increased by it. And the two aren't necessarily one causes the other, and I'll describe some of that later. This one shows a similar thing, but from 2012 to 2017 on how things have changed. As you can see, one of the illustrated factors is that cropland has increased and CRP land has decreased. And frankly, the two are related in that a lot of the CRP land was converted to cropland. Developed land always is an increase of a certain amount, and then the others, increase or decrease in somewhat smaller degrees. This is one way to illustrate the data. And this was done kind of in a special fashion. We try to depict various things using maps, but we also have to take confidentiality into consideration. So these dot maps use various techniques to show what it is we're trying to show. In this case, we're showing the predominant, in an immediate area, the predominant coverage by 4 different rural areas that are cropland, pastureland, rangeland, and forest. This is the bar chart showing the cropland and how it decreased pretty consistently from 1982 until 2007. And then in 2007, it sort of turned around and started to increase, and it increased every year since 2007 by a small, well, this one appears to be a small amount, but it's in the millions, so it's not small. And most of the increase from cropland has been land coming out of General Conservation Reserve Program land. This shows the graph of the year by year. Now, as I indicated before, the database has data every year from 2000 to the present. So from 2012 to 2017, this illustrates the cropland increase. And it shows also that it appears to be leveling off in this 2016 and 2017. This is a diagram often called a Pac-Man diagram. This is going to be illustrating the growth, what we refer to as gross change. So gross change, you can see which types of land became cropland. So which types of lands were converted to cropland from 2012 to 2017. And in this case, you can see that, that about 89% of the increase in cropland was from pasture and CRP. When you look at the land that was cropland, or the land that was cropland in 2012 and became something else in 2017, you can once again see that even though in the previous diagram the pasture, it had a lot of pasture had become cropland, in this one it illustrates that in turn a lot of cropland also converted over to pasture. And they don't exactly balance out more, but they do offset for net change. But also on the previous diagram, there was a substantial chunk that converted from CRP to cropland, and you can see that a considerably smaller amount of cropland was converted to CRP. So the net change was that a lot of CRP became cropland on a net change point of view. This shows forest and range over time. Forest has consistently either stayed very close to the same or increased every year, even though some forest is always lost to developed land. Forest tends to also gain from cropland and pasture land. Range is not quite the same. It has consistently dropped, and a lot of that over time was due to developed land. But there's also been some conversion of rangeland to cropland, and among other smaller amounts. Those are the two primaries. Another type of data that's tracked by NRI that is of considerable interest is what's called prime farmland, and that's the best combination of physical and chemical characteristics for producing crops, forage, and fiber, and there's several characteristics that go into that. And from 2012 to 2017, this shows how the number of acres of forest, cropland, grazing lands, and other rural land that have converted to developed land. So over 900,000 acres have converted from prime farmland to developed land. When the NRI was started, it wasn't intended to really be a analysis database for developed land. It was mostly just needed to identify developed land so it could pinpoint rural land. But there has been more interest of late on what's going on with developed land, and you can see how developed land increased over time in this diagram. And developed land is actually made up of urban and built-up areas and rural transportation. Of course, the urban transportation is just absorbed in the urban concept, but the rural transportation is also analyzed as developed land. And there's been a 2.3% increase over the period from 2012 to 2017. This diagram has been of interest more recently because it shows how newly developed land has decreased so much. And what's interesting is to look at this side by side with the population, and the ratio of the amount of developed land based on the population change has decreased dramatically. And this also shows that the newly developed land and how much of it came from various sources like forest, cropland, pasture, range, and other. This one is normally on presentations, this one's a real interesting diagram because it's called an automated GIF or animated GIF. And what this software won't show the change the way it would in a presentation. What this diagram did and what is in this animated GIF is it shows 1982, 87, and so on, all the way up to 2017. And with developed land, since developed land just tends to expand over time, it shows you where it expanded in each of the areas or where newer areas came in. We tried the same sort of animation using other land cover uses like cropland or range or whatever, and it doesn't show you the dramatic results that this one does, but this is another example of illustrating it with maps and colors, how you can see where certain things are pretty clearly. And one of the other claims to fame on erosion is, or on the NRI is erosion. This shows both water and wind erosion. Now, granted, this water and wind erosion, water is just the sheet and reel water erosion, not gully erosion. And the wind is what's called saltation and surface creep and doesn't cover some other forms of wind erosion. But this has been monitored since 1982, and you can see that it's fairly stable, even though you see slight changes over the past since 2007. It's been fairly stable over that time. This year in the 2017 summary report, which we provide a lot of these figures down to the state level, we decided to also add in another one because this is an average, and this rate is an average based on the total soil loss estimates. But we also included the median erosion, and we're experimenting with that because it often illustrates when the erosion average is being dominated to some degree by outliers. But erosion is very important to the NRI as well as erosion change. This is a 1982 map done with some methods called nearest neighbor averaging and similar related methods, but it illustrates where erosion is in the United States in 1982. What is interesting is to see the 2017 diagram of the same area, and you can see somewhat dramatic reduction. Again, this one shows sheet and rill erosion. It's just restricted to the water just for the sake of illustration. The NRI also collects wetland data, and it covers both not only what land is on wetlands or what is regarded as wetlands, and then of course you can see wetland change over time. A wetland is not considered a land cover use because it's actually located on other land cover uses, and as you can see in the diagram, the majority of wetland is actually located on forest land. The wetland classifications done in the NRI are done using what's referred to as the Cowardin classification, and that's in coordination with the Fish and Wildlife's National Wetland Inventory. It also uses the Cowardin classification. So availability of data. We sort of do push estimates to the state offices, and they are also experimenting with a new method, sort of a tool that we referred to as Lucid, that allows them to develop custom estimates. And then we send them automatic state web pages that they can use. The NRCS technical centers can get selected estimates. We're considering a county level database for their use. I've mentioned before the greenhouse gas inventory and the ERS, which are both internal to USDA, get actual extracts from the database itself. But for most users, the database or the requests for data can be made, can either be gotten from the summary reports themselves that contain rather massive collection of estimates, but there's also an NRI website or NRI email address on that website called nri@wdc.usda.gov, and using that, requests can be made, or at least the start of a request, because sometimes people's requests are complex, and they at least start the process via that email, and then we do interchange with them to try and nail down how we can help them and provide custom, which frequently is custom estimates, aggregated data for their particular application. So this is more or less the start of announcing the 2017 NRI. The database has just been completed. This webinar shows some estimates that we've quickly put together to provide both in the summary report and in this webinar. We will provide data to the state offices by just pushing that information out to them for their use and their cooperators. And we actually have a number of frequent users that they're doing requests for 2017 updated data for their applications. In fact, we have a waiting list already of people that are interested in that database. So the big takeaways. As I indicated, cropland continues to increase, mostly coming out of Conservation Reserve Program. We also saw that it seems to be leveling off. Rangeland continues to decrease due to development and conversion to cropland. Developed land increases, but less and less proportional to population change. And as I started out in the second slide, the big takeaway is that there's 35 years of data on over 800,000 points in a single database that allows for an enormous number of potential applications. Also, this data set is going to be used by as we mentioned before, the Soil and Water Resources Conservation Act for the 2022 assessment, so this will feed into that immediately. The Conservation Effects Assessment Project will use this data for their analyses and modeling efforts. And NRCS uses this data as one of the major contributors for their state resource assessments. And this concludes my presentation. This is the NRI website, which is also provided as a link below under today's links. Additional estimates and charts can also be found on the Resource Conservation Act website, also listed on this page under additional estimates. So from that, we'll move on to questions.
Thank you, Patrick. I have one question before we move on to questions, which is one participant requested that the developed land GIF be made available, and I have extracted that slide from your PowerPoint and I can load it into the today's handout box if that is all right with you.
That's fine. We provide
Okay.
that. It's a pretty snazzy automated GIF, and so we provide it freely. That's no problem.
Great. Sure, I will do that then. But getting started, we have several questions. So one question is, how many sites per county are included on average? And is there an attempt to compare aggregate or interpolated numbers from the NRI with other sources, such as RMA for cropland, et cetera?
Well, there's I would say, let's see, there's about 100 segments average per county, but it varies a lot depending on size of counties, and the counties vary so much that it could be several hundred. But those are the segments, and then there's 3 points per segment, so it'd be 3 times as many of that as would be available on each county. And some counties had, as we showed, or as I mentioned or showed, they have a higher density of sample based on that heterogeneity thing that we did. In terms of comparing the NRI to other data sets, it's been done a number of times. The NRI is, like for example, there's the National Land Cover Database, which doesn't use as high a resolution imagery, but they also use methods to provide data over a continuum along the ground. But because the imagery being used isn't as high resolution, but we haven't done an actual study to say this is the NRI's accuracy, this is the National Land Cover. That's in our plan. And then of course there's a lot of comparisons to the agricultural census, and there's always shows certain differences between the two because the definitions actually differ slightly. It's been kind of an issue, the fact that definitions differ. For example, there's a considerable difference between us and the Forest Service on how much forest there is because we actually use slightly different definitions of forest and what constitutes a tree, believe it or not. So that's something that we have on our work list to try and do what you might call a comprehensive analysis of the comparison between especially since it's confusing to people to have different estimates of the same thing produce different results.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. One other question, does rangeland have to be in production for it to be classified as rangeland, or simply have the characteristics of rangeland, e.g. versus forest land?
We don't, when you say in production, I mean, there's been the term grazing lands makes the presumption that the land has cows on it, and that is not necessarily the case. The way the rangeland definitions are and pasture land definitions are in the NRI, it is not necessarily based on them being used for grazing in particular. It's mostly having to do with a combination of whether it's grassland and or shrub land, and whether or not it's being managed in a certain way. That's primarily how rangeland, and all grassland and shrub land that's labeled that in this system is either eventually regarded as either rangeland or pasture land.
Okay, we have a couple questions about data access, but first I'm going to jump to another question because it's related, which is to what you're talking about now. I'm curious about two things. One, what qualifies as developed land, a road, a house, a parcel with a house or a building on it? And 2, what is the label for land that is not cropland but is privately owned grassland or other non-forested land, perhaps retired cropland?
Well, the developed land thing is a complex process. It's mostly done based on whether it fits certain categories. A lot of it is land that has been paved or otherwise altered for use as developed land. Even land that is managed in a way like, for example, you might have a factory, and then the area surrounding the factory is somewhat paved, and some of the area is also converted, and there's the grass has been cut down, and then fences are put around it. It's a fairly complex process for developed land. The obvious ones are things like when I indicated that rural transportation. That one, for example, includes not only the road itself, but also the area, the easement area around the sides of the road that goes with the road. And houses are developed land. We use a fairly complex process of that, where the data collector actually marks where a house is, and then a waiting process. Like if you have a house in the middle of the country and it's a single house, it would not be regarded as a developed land area, because I mean that could be a single house related to a farm or something like that. When you have a group of houses, then they can be regarded as developed land, and we use a process to determine whether it appears its a group of houses are interrelated or close enough together to be regarded as developed land. It's more complicated than that, but that's just sort of a general idea. If you have privately owned, well, like I said, we collect data on non-federal land, and if it's grass, and it's determined by what is there, whether or not it's grass or not, whether it's privately owned, and we collect data on cropland based on the, we first have the determination made that it appears to be cropland based on the imagery. And we have people that are fairly well trained in that, and then it goes on to the state offices, who then will tell us more detail about that cropland. It doesn't necessarily have to be a farm. I mean, in theory, you could have cropland that's just associated with a house, but if it's a planted area, and it's regarded as cropland as long as it's our NRCS state offices know about it, and they don't necessarily have to have administrative records, but they could know about the fact that there's cropland over here. And our local offices in NRCS know pretty much know about all the cropland in their area.
Okay. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to move on. And I'm going to throw all of the data access questions at you at once, because you're doing a great job of tracking multi-part questions. So how do I contact NRCS to make a data request is one question. Does it cost anything to get data from the NRI? And then, can access to county-level databases be gained by non-NRCS personnel, asking from an extension perspective?
Okay. The email address for asking for data is on the website. I mentioned it before. It's nri@wdc.usda.gov. But if you go to that website, it's listed there as the help desk contact, and that's the primary way that we get requests for data. You also have my email address, and I've received requests directly to me from people as well. In terms of, it does not cost anything to get data. How quickly and et cetera, on whether you can, how fast you can get the data, et cetera, depends on how complicated your request is. We get a lot of requests that they just frankly want all the data, and we, because of confidentiality, we start off by saying, well, that's not going to happen. So then we do some interchange back and forth with the requester, finding out what they're trying to accomplish, and then we see how we can put together our, a data set or a set of estimates that will suit their needs. Regarding the county level database, so far we have been somewhat restricted on the county level, but might say is a point level database that has geography below county removed. The reason we are somewhat restrictive on that is that we have not completed a comprehensive set of metadata, and a lot of the data can be misinterpreted if without that metadata. So we've worked with people on whether they really need that database or whether they could achieve what they want with estimates. For example, we have people that would want the point level estimates at the county level removed so it's not confidential. But what they really want is they just want county estimates of a certain, so we've given people those county estimates, and that's not confidential, and it's done frequently. So those kind of things can be gotten. For example, we get a request on how much developed land there was in each county in South Carolina, and we provided that data, providing an estimate of the total developed land for every county, and we do that and have done that across the country on not only developed land but any of the other estimates as well.
Okay, thank you. There is a comment in the chat. It says, side issue, land impacted by natural disasters, hurricane impacted, wildfire impacted information, if available, could be used to reduce actual figures of actual cropland in effect at that point in time. I hope this makes sense. And I'm
well, I mean, primarily one of the interests when there's a natural disaster, since we collect data only one whole year at a time, if you have a natural disaster on this year and our data is going to be collected, then the change data should be able to show you in a geographic area how much it has changed. I know that as 2017 is now becoming available, one point of interest is going to be in the Puerto Rico estimates.
Okay, thank you. I want to send a reminder out. One person asked if we will be sending out the link for the recorded webinar. The link for the recorded webinar is found in the today's links box. It's the Conservation Outcomes webinar schedule and archived webinars. So you should be able to find the archived webinar there within, I would say by tomorrow or Monday at the latest. Okay, so we have one more question and we have time for another question. Some NRI work occurs on BLM land, and you briefly describe the working relationship, or can you briefly describe the working relationship between BLM and NRCS regarding NRI work?
Yeah, the work done on BLM land is the grazing lands. I referred to that sub-sample that we take. We actually do the same kind of collection on BLM work, but it isn't subsampled from the NRI. It's a sample that was made on BLM land by Iowa State University, and we collect the data on BLM land under an agreement with them. They actually pay to have our state offices collect their data that they use for their monitoring program. And we collect it the same way using the same methods that we do for our grazing lands on-site collection. And that's primarily the agreement. After we had done it ourselves on rangeland in particular for a lot of years, the BLM wanted to use the same methods and have it done on their land, and we've been doing it for some time now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Patrick. We're at the end of the hour. There was some concern that the slide that I posted into the handouts box was not the animated GIF, but it should be the GIF. You just can't observe it unless you play the slide in slideshow mode. So however, if you have any problems with that, you can email Patrick to get a copy of the GIF, or you can email me at elizabeth.marshall@usda.gov, and we'll send that along. So thank you. I just want to take a moment to thank Associate Chief Alvarado and Patrick Flanagan for taking time out of their schedules for today's presentation. And thanks also to everyone who attended the webinar. We hope everyone can make it next month for our next installment in our webinar series, which will be entitled Quantifying Conservation Effects on Multiple Wetland Ecosystem Services. Understanding Trade-offs is the name of the game. Thank you and have a great afternoon.